gold spray knives across iron prows. Black banners snap like ravens' wings. The Alcarinqua of the west burns red in a false dawn as drums roll from ship to ship. Bells in a white city ring in alarm. Eagles plummet trailing smoke. Quenya and Adonai mingle in screams. Ash falls soft on alabaster stairs. The sea tastes like metal. A golden king strides into a mountain cleft, while, above, an untouchable throne watches without moving. If this journey stirs the imagination, the channel would be honored by a like and a subscription. The storytellers love hearing where listeners are watching from and what they wish to explore next. Share a thought, then listen on. In the last waning of Númenor's pride, when the western sky held a brightness that none dared name, the great armament assembled at Romena. Ships like cities, sails like storm fronts, whose smoke from 1,000 forges turned the gulfs into twilight at noon. In the marketplaces of Armanelos, caged birds fell asleep at odd hours, and the old could not keep their hands from trembling. The bread tasted like iron. The white tree in the court of the king had been cut down long before, a scent of lost spring, lingering only in memory, and now the hiss of its burning was the lullaby for an island that no longer believed in lullabies. He had taken the name Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, and in the polished steel of his halls, he loved the sight of himself most, when light struck him like a coin. Sauron, who had come to Númenor captive and smiling, knelt at the foot of that brightness and taught him words that tasted of smoke and honey. When candles were spent and courtiers staggered out, Sauron leaned close and whispered into the king's ear. And even the tapestries strained to hear. "Another fruit grows beyond the ban," Sauron said one night, as if by chance, as if mentioning that a foreign harbour had good anchorage. Not the fading shadow of Nimloth, not a cutting nor a memory, but the tree itself, without death in its sap. They hoard it. They speak to you of patience and hope for men. But when did they ever stand a watch at your walls? Ar-Pharazôn's laugh was not quite a laugh. They stand on mountains and read hearts. I will stand on their mountains and read theirs. Sauron's smile widened, but not with joy. Then build, then swear your captains. Make the sea groan with your going. There were those who stood another watch, far from light and polished floors. In a lean house in Romena, Amandil, the lord of Andunia, sat with his son Elendil beside an open window. Outside, the gulls fell silent as the smoke rolled in. Elendil's hands were calloused from honest work as much as from the sword, for he lived in two worlds that touched only in the dreams of the faithful. "Father," Elendil said, "when they go, if they go." Amandil did not let his gaze stray from the line between sea and sky. "They go already," he said. "The sound of those hammers is not for show. They will go because they are afraid of what waits when they do not. Men are strange that way. We rush toward the thing we fear most to show that it was never frightening, or to drown out the sound of our own hearts. Could the Valar forgive this of us?" "Forgiveness is not a wall you can lean on," Amandil said. "It is a wind. You can stand in it or turn your back to it. What matters is whether it still blows when you are broken." Elendil pressed his forehead to his knuckles. He could feel the island itself in his bones, the weight and balance of it, the long slopes, the smell of wet grass on dawns when the sea lay like hammered blue glass. The idea of leaving that spiked his tongue with bitterness, and yet every morning more of their friends vanished to the prisons of Armanelos, or the new altars where fires burned day and night. A boy crossed the square with a basket on his head. The basket reeked of tar and lavender leaves crushed to drive off the smell. He put it down briefly and stared toward the harbour where masts made a forest of shadows. Somewhere, a woman sang an old lullaby without words, just a rise and fall that had comforted children since before names. The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve and moved on. On the decks of the greatest ships, men made careful lists of ropes, water skins, salt meat, spare oars. Beneath those lists lay another that no one had written, of things that could not be counted. The faces of younger brothers who would not kiss their foreheads again, the scent of the gardens under the hill where someone had once held their hand in the rain, the feel of a mother's hair against a cheek covered with tears. A captain named Calaryon, whose ancestors had first sailed to Umbar when its towers were just stakes with cloth pinned to them, walked between his men with a face like stone. He bent now and then as if to draw a circle on the deck with a finger, then straightened before the line could form and paced away. When the last oath had been spoken, when the last spear had been sharpened, when the last whisper had been squeezed of doubt, then the fleet pulled from the harbours of Romena. Drums spoke to drums. One ship moved like a slow heartbeat, then another, and the sea took them. People on the cliffs leaned, and no sound came from their mouths, though they were speaking with their whole bodies. The smoke from all the torches laid a road westward on the water, and for a moment it seemed that Númenor itself might slide after the ships, a vast city unmoored, palace towers and alleyways and fig trees and ovens and wells and all. What is victory when the road that leads to it tastes like ashes from the first step? On the fifth day, an unnatural silence rose from water and sky. No gulls, no whales spouting in the distance. The men standing at rails felt that silence spread into their joints and make them ache. Their mouths tasted of brass, and a few saw their own reflections in the sea and did not recognize themselves. Sauron walked the deck wrapped in a cloak of black silk that breathed like a storm, and he smiled to see how even the bright weather vanes lost the will to turn. He came to Calaryon and rested a hand on the rail, exactly where the captain always stood at dawn and looked west. "You fear what you cannot measure," Sauron said. "I fear that I cannot measure it because I am not meant to," Calaryon replied. He kept his eyes on the sea. "You were meant to rule the sea," Sauron said lightly. "If there were a script for you, you would have written it. If there were a border, you would have drawn it. What cannot be measured cannot be worshipped." He left the rail as softly as a shadow withdrawing. On the seventh day, the mists parted, and the mountains of Ammon rose like walls of pearl and steel. The Pelori were not merely tall. They were tall in a way that mocked tallness, that made a mockery of language. Ships at oars seemed like ants moving toward a mirror. On Tanicatil, winds that had never felt the breath of men paused and shuddered. Bells that had rung only for festivals now pealed with alarm. The Eldar, standing on the terraces of Tirion, knew the shape of those ships from stories of their own exile. The light in their eyes dimmed. Eonwer, banner-bearer and herald, stood in the halls of Manwë, with steel in his bones and pity in his gaze. He had presided over gifts to men at their awakening, had seen them walk into the world with their heads raised to stars that were songs, though not points of light. To stand now and see ships built by those very hands come to break these shores shook him like an old tree in a new wind. Manwë looked out from the high seat without moving. To those who waited, the stillness was unbearable. Varda's hand lay near his. She did not move either. That they could have done 1,000 things was not in question. What was in question could not be spoken in that hall, not even in thought. To call upon the one in anger was to build a bridge of iron directly into the heart of the world and then light it on fire. Nienna walked along the mountain paths, tears on her face, but those tears carried meanings none there could read. Aule set his tools down. Tulkas flexed his hands and stared at his knuckles as if they belonged to someone else. Ulmo rolled like a part of the sea that had been thinking since the first drop fell, and even he found no shape for this wave. The Númenórean armada threaded the Calakiria, the pass of light, which now felt like the throat of a beast swallowing knives. Eagles stooped because they had always stooped when cities were threatened, but they died in smoke and flame. Men with longbows, trained to hit an apple at twice an arrow's reach, brought down birds whose wings had shadowed empires. A spear from the foredeck of the king's flagship struck a high angelic figure descending with blazing eyes, and the figure reeled and vanished like a lightning flash swallowed by cloud. Tyrion's bells screamed. Elven mothers pulled children inward, but their own hands shuddered. On the terrace of a white house, as an elf named Erwin looked up and remembered the first time she had waded in the fountains of the city, water cold, foot soles scraped on stone, hair smelling of orange flowers when she ran home. She did not believe in time in the way men did, yet something broke in that memory. Ar-Pharazôn set his foot on the sand of Eldar. He had imagined a crack of thunder, a trumpet blast, a shock of immortality like a draught of molten gold. Instead, the wind was cool. The sand squeaked under his heel. He raised his sword, and the reflection in the blade was ordinary. Behind him, his men plunged standards into rich soil and raised tents that stank of whale oil and sweat. They dug pits. They erected a dais. The sun crossed the sky the way it always had. If there had been a victory, it had not yet been named. Messengers ran to Valmar, to the Mahaxar, and the Ring of Doom. They found only chairs, no judge sitting, no Yavanna with her hands in her lap like gardens sleeping, no Vaire with her threads glowing like stars pulled down soft to hold. The chairs sat, and the light, such as it was, fell on them and made them look as ordinary as chairs. Word spread. The city of Tyrion, in a reverie broken, began to pour out. Bronze gates closed, then opened, then closed again, for no one knew which choice was correct. Ar-Pharazôn rode into the Calateria with Sauron at his side and 1,000 men at his back, and the white stairs of Tyrion climbed like a lullaby written in stone. He smelled ash and honeysuckle, sweat and hot metal. His men watched elves of untouchable beauty flee and gather like deer. He nodded once to Sauron. "Is this all?" the king said. "Is there no thunder? Where is the hand that held us back?" "Perhaps it was never a hand," Sauron said, eyes downcast. "Perhaps it was a choice, and choices have edges. Edges cut. Men hold swords all the time. So do the powers. In that hour, in the marshes near the mouths of the Gwathlo in Middle-earth, a fisherman named Bran stood waist-deep in water and tried to fix a snagged net. His hands were numb, though the sun was on his neck. Birds had left. What rose toward him instead was a hush that made him want to whisper to the reeds. He had no words for the West, had never seen more than the faintest suggestion of light beyond storms. He felt suddenly that his father's stories had been untrue, in a way that was worse than lies. They had been only shadows of something now broken for good. He pulled up an empty net and stared as if into a grave. In the house at Romena, where the sea had spoken through the window for years, Amandil set his jaw. He had made his decision nights before, when sleep had become a stranger who would not knock. He kissed Elendil on the brow, as if his son were a child again, and then he went with 3 companions to the small ship concealed under a net of reeds and rope. They pulled her into the water with the prayer of those who loved both land and sea, and could not choose between them, except by losing one. The tide took them like a hand that did not need to grip hard. Amandil stood at the tiller and listened to his heartbeat and the old secret songs that ran through the keel of the world. He would go as far as he could into that forbidden light, not with spear or torch, but with open hands. Men had been given the gift of swift death, which had often felt like a curse. He would, if he could, throw himself on the mercy of those who had not been given that gift. In Armanelos, where gold leaf peeled with the heat of so many fires, the people gathered before a new altar Sauron had ordered built. It rose like a black tooth from the square. Prisoners were dragged up steps that had not cooled since first they were set. The priest, a fat man with eyes that liked to meet other eyes, smiled often to show that he was gentle. He performed his role with elegance. There was a sound like a distant roll of thunder, or perhaps it was the roar of the crowd. It was not quite possible to tell. Isildur, son of Elendil, had once stolen a fruit from Nimloth, the white tree that had refused to grow in that square, despite all the king's demands. He had bled for it and had not regretted the pain. Now he stood at the back of the crowd with a hood pulled low, a knife in his sleeve, and knowledge that he was keeping inside himself the seed of a world that might already have been lost. His breath was slow. The smell of fat and incense made him want to retch, but he did not. The crowd's surge loosened the stones beneath his feet. He knew the names of those who might die that day. Knowledge is a burden that can make a man bend, but it can also make him stand when he would run. In Tirion, the day stretched. Evening came anyway, because the world had its habits and did not break them easily. The lamps were lit. The light had a softness it had not carried since before men first walked under it. Men went about their business in the city of a deathless people, making lists, drawing maps, establishing the practice of their empire in a place where empires had never been supposed to stand. Some sang at their work, some did not. An elf sat with its back to a wall and spoke aloud into both hands, as if those hands were ears. Sauron led Ar-Pharazôn through Valmar, where the streets had been walked by feet that did not tire and voices that did not age. Hammers lay on benches in owless quarters, and they were heavy with significance, only because hands gave them meaning. Yavanna's gardens rustled they had never known fear before, and now leaves rubbed against leaves like prayers. At the Ring of Doom, Ar-Pharazôn ascended and touched the empty seat of Manwë, as if he were checking the weave of a tapestry for flaws. "Would you sit in it?" Sauron said mildly. "I would not crouch," Ar-Pharazôn said. He opened his hand and closed it. He laughed then, the sound strange in that place. And if I did sit, would that be the end? Would I be immortal, or would I only feel a weight? "Who knows?" Sauron said. "There are halls below these courts where a different chair waits, and the one who sits in it speaks fewer riddles. Would you like to hear him?" He keeps account in the only coin that never devalues. The king glanced at him. Mandos. Mandos, Sauron agreed softly. He will not move, but he will speak. He loves truths more than he loves mercy. Then let us put a question before him, Ar-Pharazôn said. He turned, cloak swinging, and the guards moved like a wave. In the high halls, a rumour moved before them as the wind moves before a storm. Servants listened at corners, their fingers white on plates. A Maya named Ilmare paused in a passage and fled without being sure why she fled. The door to Mando's halls opened without hand or key. It was colder there, the kind of cold that made bones speak their pain softly to the mind. Fires burned in iron cups and gave no heat. The king's breath was visible. Sauron did not breathe. Mandos stood in a doorway. He had no face that Ar-Pharazôn could recognize, and yet the king felt stared at by every eye that had ever watched him since his first step. He raised his chin as a man in a storm opens his throat to take it. Lord of Dooms, Ar-Pharazôn said, I have come to ask why men must die. Mandos' answer was the sort of silence that is not empty, but filled with the weight of an ocean. When he spoke, the words made the torches bend. You cannot bear the truth, Mandos said. Try me, Ar-Pharazôn breathed, and for the first time his voice did not ring in the room that held him. You were made to go, not to stay, Mandos said. You were given a lane of wind and water and brief, hot fire. You were given the chance to spend what you are in full. Dying is not falling off a cliff. It is laying down a load and stepping onto another road. I will not lay down what is mine, Ar-Pharazôn said, anger lifting him like wine. Then it will be taken, Mandos replied, and his voice was now like the scraping of stones under a glacier. The question is not whether you will fall, it is whether you will choose who to land on. Sauron smiled slightly and stepped forward. There is, perhaps, another question, he said. What happens if the door is never closed again? His hand moved lightly. The unseen patterns that girded the place, woven from the first hum of the world, bent like reeds. A seam, subtle as the thread in Viress tapestry, tugged. Mandos turned his head. It would be told later, if there were later, that even he had not expected this. A crack showed not in the wall, but in the air. A line like the seam of a great cloak came into view. From it there breathed a wind that smelled of the first dark before the first light. The door of night was far away, but doors speak to one another when they are moved without respect, mouth to mouth, like midwives exchanging secrets in a language no man can quite hear. Mandos reached, and in that reaching, he was beautiful and terrible. He set his hands on what had no handle and tried to press shut what should never have been forced open. Some things are not supposed to be seen with eyes. For a heartbeat, Ar-Pharazôn saw them. Pale legions without shape, grief that had forgotten its cause, fear that had travelled so long that it had worn out its name. They pressed toward the breach and surged back and pressed again like a tide without a moon. Something vast turned its head. Sauron stopped smiling. For the first time in an age, he remembered being afraid. The torches went out. Men cried out. Ar-Pharazôn's hand dropped to his sword without his permission. He drew. The steel sang and then fell silent, because there was nothing to strike that steel could answer. Mandos spoke a word that was not a word. The seam shrank. Sauron flung both palms outward with a thought that had burned cities in its day. Between them, a thin space flickered like a fish halfway out of water. If it had been opened for a moment longer, perhaps the door would have heard and opened. It did not. Or if it did, it opened only a finger's breadth. And one breath through it changed the world that waited like a house with all its windows open. Above Valmar, clouds that had not been named since the first naming gathered. They were not thunderheads. They were something else, heavy with intent. Ulmo raised the sea against them, and the waters leapt like hounds. Tulkas ran. The halls shook. Sauron turned deliberately away from the place where his thought had almost brought back the hand he served. He was wise enough not to look again. He bowed to Ar-Pharazôn, whose face had become the face of a man who has thrown a spear so high it might never land. "Forgive me," Sauron said softly. "I misjudged. The door is not yet ready to open. Perhaps with more—" He gestured at the men around them as if they were patient animals. "Conviction." Ar-Pharazôn put out his hand to steady himself on Mandos' doorframe, and Mandos looked at that hand and then moved away into his halls without comment. The king straightened. His breath came easier. He did not know that his hair had turned a shade paler. He did not know that a thin seam had opened in the fabric of his heart and would never quite close. In Romana, Elendil slept, face down on plans for boats and stores. Lines of ink turned to smudges under his cheek. The night had an odd stillness. He woke with the sensation that someone had spoken his name without sound. He sat up and listened to the planks. The sea beyond his window seemed to be counting. Isildur in Armenelos put his hand to his chest as if someone had pressed a cold coin there and whispered an old blessing he had not said aloud in years. The faithful began to move because they had run out of other ways to stand. They took only what they could lift on their backs and what they could hide under benches and inside baskets. They kissed door frames. They did not look back because looking back multiplies what you leave behind until you cannot carry it. Elendil gathered them by twos and fours. He had been tall from youth, and now he seemed taller, not because his spine had lengthened, but because grief and resolve are measuring sticks that add inches to anyone. They loaded ships at night using tar-smeared hands and whispers. Children were told to put their mouths on their own knuckles if they felt a cry rising. Even so, a small sound would escape like a bird getting out of a coop. Men would freeze and wait for the stamp of boots. Those boots did not always come. Tamiriel, she who would have been queen if fire had not taken her path away under the feet of Ar-Pharazôn, walked a corridor deep in the king's house. She had knowledge that she moved as if carrying on her head something larger than any basket. When she entered a particular room, a wind moved the curtains and tugged gently at her hair. She closed the window. On a table lay a small bundle wrapped in cloth the color of new leaves. She opened it. A white seed glowed faintly without light. She kissed it once and closed the bundle and walked away with it under her gown. Sauron met her that night by accident or design, and he bowed with a grace that had nothing in it of respect. He looked at her as if she were a glass that held water, and he could see his own thirst inside. "Cousin," he said, for he used the familial endearments of the king's house when he felt like it. She looked at him as if he were a taste she could not quite swallow. "You are clever," she said. "Will it be enough? Will it ever be enough for you or for him? Your cleverness, I mean. Will you die?" He smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. "No," he said, "not as men die." "Then you do not understand us at all," she said. You have never feared anything you could not face twice. You do not know what it means to choose the one time. All of our choices bleed. Yours do not." He stepped aside. She walked past him. His eyes followed the place where the cloth lay under her gown and measured whether it was worth the trouble. Then he raised his eyes and measured the trouble. On the white stairs of Tirion, Ar-Pharazôn held court. The Eldar came with heads high and eyes full of the sorrow of mountains. They did not kneel. He did not ask them to. He announced that his men would be quartered in their houses, and there would be no harm if there were no harm. He announced taxes. He announced that certain halls would be closed until further notice. A Maya named Oser stood in a courtyard with his feet on stone and thought of reefs. He had always loved laughter that was risk. He considered bringing the cliff down on the court. He did not. He went down to the sea instead and beat it into a boil with a glance. The ships surged and then steadied because their men were good and had learned their trade before this madness began. What did the grasslands of the north think that day, the place men would name Rohan in time? The wind slid through it and made a sound like a hand over a drum. Horses raised their heads. A boy on a low hill looked west and felt cold pass through him, as if he were no more than straw tied in a bundle and left in a field. His mother watched him turn and thought, "He is learning to be a man," and had no idea what kind. At Andunia, in the west of Númenor, where the faithful had loved the sunsets as if the light had loved them back, Elendil and his people pushed off. Behind them, from a high place in Armenelos, a thin column of smoke climbed like a finger pointing into a book. On the prow, a young woman named Nawen gripped the rail until her knuckles hurt. She had held babies in hot kitchens, and she had been loved there, and now she did not know what would be loved in the place where they were going. A child beside her hiccuped. She lifted the child and held it to her skin and breathed slowly, and the child's lungs learned the shape of her breaths and matched them. Amandil did not return. He had gone, and the sea had closed, and when Elendil looked west at night, sometimes he thought he could see a tiny flicker and told himself it was a torch handheld by an old man being brave. He did not believe this, but to pretend to believe something is sometimes the only way to prevent grief from picking up a chair and hurling it through a window. In Aman, Sauron taught the king a new lesson each day. He taught him how to ride the boundaries of oaths. He taught him how to mine meanings from words that had never been meant to be taken as maps. He taught him that patience is a way of violence as strong as swords. "We will need a right," Sauron said at last. When the smell of salt and honeysuckle had filled his lungs so long, he felt the ghost of drowning. "We will need to open a greater door with a greater key. The door of night is not closed with wood. It is closed with songs. We will need to raise a song made from men." Ar-Pharazôn looked at him from beneath lids that had begun to sag, even as his grip grew stronger. "How many?" "Enough," Sauron said. "How do I know that the door you open will not bring in what I cannot drive out?" "You do not," Sauron said. "You never have." At night, he stood on the terrace of a house that had no walls and stared toward a place so far beyond the world that even he could not quite make out the outline. He whispered names in a language older than the hills and felt no answer. Then he whispered another name, the last of the old names, and the one that had burned in Angband like a brand on his tongue, and he felt something like a smile in a room where no one stood. Elendel's ships reached Middle-earth. They were led by currents that felt like help and fogs that did not feel like coincidence. They beached where the Anduin spread itself into many arms and laughed down to the sea in pieces. They unloaded onto mud and sand, and they fell on their knees and kissed the dirt. It was not Númenor. It was not close. But it was land that did not ask for a price that none could pay. Elendel named places under his breath that had never been named by him. Anúminas, he said later, by a shining lake in the north that held the sky like a handful of water. He named Minas Ithil and Minas Anor for the moons, and the sun he could not keep himself from loving. He sent men into the woods of Calenardon, where grass lay like green hair cut and left on the floor, and they came back with stories of wind and emptiness, and a feeling like a hand on the back pushing them. Gil-galad in Lindon listened to the sea like a man listening through a wall for a child crying. When Elendel came to him, they stood in a room whose windows opened onto a way that had once carried ships toward Tol Eressëa, in the time when no man had ever thought to set fire to a tree in Valinor. They spoke as men speak when they have survived sorrow and are not yet afraid to love again. "You come from ruin," Gil-galad said. "We all do," Elendel replied. "You brings ruins with you," the elf said. He said it not as an accusation, but as a truth that would need to be carried by both. "We bring tools and stories," Elendel said. "We bring bread that does not keep, and heads that do. We bring a seed." Gil-galad looked at him with eyes that had watched mountains change shape. "Then plant it where the wind can find it," he said. "Do not plant it where men feel safest." Sauron built his altar in Valmar to mirror the one in Armenelos. It was smaller, more elegant, made to look as if it had always been in that square. He brought men across the sea, and he brought elves down from their houses, and he brought Maya as witnesses. He would have brought Valar if he had been able. He drew circles in ash. He drew them with a hand that remembered drawing other circles long ago under the black vaults. He drew lines that crossed each other and diverged. He taught the king to speak words that bruised the air like stones thrown into still water. He drew a pattern that would reach out to the door of night and pull. Ar-Pharazôn looked tired and more beautiful than ever, which is the way of certain men in their last arrogances. He had dreamed of sitting, motionless, while the world laid itself down and became quiet. He had not dreamed of the effort. He stood in the ring of ash and said what Sauron told him to say. It had rained the night before. The stones shone. People stood around the square, some because they had always come when called, some because they did not know how not to. An elf held the hand of a child. A soldier from Númenor rolled his shoulder to loosen a pain he had begun to carry in the bone itself. He had not killed anyone yet on this side of the sea. He made a bargain with himself. He would kill only those who tried to kill him. Tar Miriel, the inner corner shadowed by vines that had grown out of the walls when the world was young, waited with her bundle. She had agreed to something with Elendel that had cost them both blood of the heart. If she could come, she would. If she could not, the seed would go by other hands. She looked at the king and felt something break in her that was not anger and not pity. She had thought she had run out of things to break. The ritual began. The air thickened. The sound of breath grew loud. Men put their hands on their ribs and pressed without knowing it. Sauron's voice wove into Ar-Pharazôn's, like black thread through gold. A wind came that blew from no direction at all. The door listened. In the north, on the long moors above the Shire that would one day hold hobbit laughter like rain in a wine cup, a shepherd looked up and saw stars shake. He was not afraid of stars. He had slept under them enough times to think they were friendly. He put his hand on the neck of a dog whose fur smelled of lanolin and grass. The dog lifted his head and whimpered. The shepherd said, "Hush, little one," without thinking, and his voice shook. In Osgiliath, which was not yet a city but a collection of stones and hopes, a mason named Myron laid one block and wiped his face, and laid another, and did not know why he wanted to weep. The river ran by full of its own business, mindless of gods. The door opened a slit. It opened not like a hinge, but like a song being sung by someone far away who does not want to be heard. From it something leaned, and the world bent toward that leaning like a tree catching a wind. Sauron's eyes went bright and wide. And Ar-Pharazôn felt a coolness on his cheeks that was not wind and was not tears. Manwë stood up for the first time since the ships had landed. He did not speak. He lifted his hand. Varda's hand moved with his without touching it. They did not call on the One. They spoke instead to all the little things that had ever listened to them, to the feathers of birds and the leaves of trees and the thoughts of lambs. They braided those answers into a rope of quiet power, and they threw that rope toward the door. Ulmo rose. He rose in the harbours of Eldamar, and outside the mouths of Anduin, and on every lake where a woman had gone to wash her hands after kneading dough, and had been surprised to see her face looking back. He rose, and water remembered being strong, and it leaped. Sauron felt the rope slide under his ankle and smirked. He cut it with a thought, because he was very good at his work. Varda looked at him as if he were a man who had broken a child's toy and could not stop laughing. Nienna wept, and in the halls of Mandos there was a sound like a harp string breaking and Viress weaving stilled. Tulkas ran into the square, and his face was terrible. He did not run often. He had always laughed when he ran. He did not laugh now. He picked up Sauron by the throat and held him, and for a moment Sauron's face showed exactly what he was without his masks. Then Sauron slipped like smoke and reappeared behind Ar-Pharazôn and put a hand flat on the king's back and pushed gently, like a friend guiding a friend toward a door he had asked not to go through. The door opened a little wider. The wind from it smelled like iron cooled in snow, and like fog over a battlefield before anyone has moved. Mandos spoke again, this time in a tone that broke things without touching them. "Enough," he said. The word hit the square overhead, like a stone dropped in a pond, and the ripples passed through bone and brick and cloud. The door closed. It closed fast. Sauron jerked his hand back as if burned. Ar-Pharazôn staggered. He looked at his hand, where no wound showed, and he saw there the shadow of a ring that had never been made. A figure rose at the edge of the square. Tarmiriel stepped into light. She held the bundle under her gown with one hand and lifted the other high. "Pharazôn," she said, and her voice carried with the absolute clarity of someone who has chosen her last words. "Look at me." He looked. He had always looked at her. In another world, they would have looked at each other and grown older laughing. "In this world," she said, "it cannot give you what you want. It will take and ask for more. You have been a king all your life. Try, just once, to be a man." He might have laughed, a harsh bark like striking flint. He did not. A muscle moved in his jaw. He took a step toward her. Sauron reached and took his sleeve as if steadying him, and did not quite let go. Guards surged. Tamiriel backed, and then one of them, a boy from the farms of Hyaristar brought to the capital to hold a spear because he was tall, hesitated and she passed, and then another made a bad choice and grabbed for the bundle and tore cloth. The seed fell into light and shone like a tear, and the whole square went quiet. It was not a light that blinded. It was a light that remembered something everyone had forgotten and offered to give it back. Sauron moved like a whip. He snatched for the bright speck with a swiftness that had caught eagles by the throat. A hand struck his wrist, and he turned with fury that had slept only a moment. Ar-Pharazôn's hand. The king did not look at Sauron. He looked at the seed as it fell again and rolled. Tamiriel dropped to her knees and pressed both hands over it and flattened herself to the ground as a blow took her in the back. She made a sound like a songbird crushed under a boot, and then made no sound at all. The small brightness went out. The thing under her hands became no more than a seed with no glow and no mercy. She was still. Sauron stood very still, which he only did when he was counting. He counted and saw the sum fall short, not because of numbers, but because of a word he had not expected to hear. The word was no. He could not bear it. He was very used to yes, Ar-Pharazôn reeled. He looked at Sauron as if seeing him for the first time, which is a terrible thing to say of a man seeing his truest counselor. He raised his hand and struck Sauron, and his palm hurt for a long time after because he had struck a truth, and truths fight back. Enough, Ar-Pharazôn said, and in his voice was not Mando's command, but a human exhaustion that carried more weight for those who had known him. He looked at the square, at the men whose shoulders ached, at the elves whose eyes reflected stars that had not yet fallen. He looked at Tamiriel, dead and small. He put his hands to his head, as if it were a crown too heavy to hold. Sauron smiled very softly. He had orchestrated empires around such moments. He was the conductor of weariness, the composer of resignation. He stepped back, and his step backward was the most dangerous step anyone had taken that day. Ar-Pharazôn slept that night like a man half drowned. In his sleep, Mandos came and sat by his bed, not to speak, but to lay a weight on his chest that was both doom and pity. The king's breath laboured. In the morning, he rose with hair grey and eyes young, which can happen to men when they give away all their days at once. He walked to the edge of Tirion and looked down on the sea and saw elven ships leaving quietly, for the Eldar had decided to go east for the first time in thousands of years. He saw a swan ship cut the water like a knife and thought of blood. He sat on a bench where once a child had eaten an orange without wiping the juice from their chin, and he put both hands over his face. Sauron sloughed his smiling skin and went with a handful of his most faithful into the mountains. He had realized something. He could not force the door in Valmar open as he had intended, but he could pull the world toward the door if he could make enough small doors open at once. Númenor was his beloved instrument for that, but he did not love instruments when they broke in his hands. He would go back to Middle-earth, to walls that loved him, to a mountain whose name was a part of his own. The Valar had chosen not to break the world with the One's hand. He could work in such a world, and he could work forever. He left smiling, and the smile had nothing to do with lips. The Valar stood together and then apart. Manwë did not weep. Nienna did. Aula looked at his hands, those hands that had taught so much making and had had a pupil who had learned too well. Did we teach them pride? He asked the air, which answered only by moving across his wrists. Ulmo sank into his seas with the heaviness of someone who has seen a drowning that could have been a swimming, if only a hand had been held out at the right moment. Varda went to a high place and dimmed certain stars. She did not do this to punish. She did it so that Sauron would have fewer points with which to draw his lines. Light itself is a kind of language. She cut out certain sentences. It would make the night heavier for shepherds and sailors. She did it anyway. In Númenor, the fires at the dark altars burned lower. People stopped going because they were tired. The crowd will do anything when it is fresh. It is different when the smell of fat and incense is simply a part of the street. The priests still smiled. A boy who had held a spear and seen a woman die left the army at night and went home and put his head in his mother's lap. She stroked his hair. He slept, and in his sleep jerked as if a fish had tugged on a line tied to his ribs. Elendel's settlements grew. Pelargir rose on a point of land with the river running by, and the sound of hammering there had the joyful tempo of men who are making a place for children. Bread rose, fences fell, and were rebuilt stronger. Gil-galad's people walked on green roads under Elrond's thoughtful rule, and taught men to plant trees in such a way that the roots would hold fast and yet not strangle each other. The grasslands of Calenardon rolled and rolled, and sometimes at night a sound came across them like a giant sigh, and men sat up and put more wood on the fire. A hobbit ancestor, not yet named, sat in a burrow that had not yet been dug, in a part of the world where the hills fold into one another like blankets, and somewhere in his sleep he turned and smiled, and then frowned because the stars had dimmed, and he was not sure why. If he had been awake, he might have asked himself whether the world itself slept. Isildur came to Osgiliath and watched Myron the Mason set a block, and they spoke like men who will be friends and enemies without knowing when they will be either. "You have a steady hand," Isildur said. "It shakes at night," Myron replied. "I dream of the sea rising up onto a city that is not here." "Dreams travel," Isildur said. "Sometimes they bring the weather. Sometimes they bring nothing but heat." "Do they bring hope?" Myron asked. "Never," Isildur said. "Hope is a thing you carry. It does not come to you." He smiled, and in that smile were both the father and the boy who had bled for a fruit. Messages came from Lindon. Gil-galad would stand, but he could not save what would not save itself. Elendil read those messages and wept once, in private, with his head bent. Then he put on his cloak and went out into rain. But he spoke to men who were tired, and to women who were pregnant, and to children who did not understand why their fathers were short-tempered and their mothers silent. He spoke of a kingdom they would build, of watchtowers, of the names of their streams. He spoke of planting a tree. "What if it dies?" a woman asked. She had her hair braided tight because loose hair was a luxury in work this hard. "Then we plant another," he said. "If we do nothing because we fear to fail, we have already failed." Sauron returned to Mordor by ways that were not ways, and moved under mountainsides and surfaced where he wanted to. He did not take a body for a while, so that he could listen better. He heard fear moving in the heart of the world like a mouse under a floor, a small scrambling that never stopped. He smiled. He set his hands to his work. Númenor did not fall into the sea. That was the old story that would not be told now, or perhaps it would be told as a caution. Beware, or your house will drown. In this world, the island remained. It was not the same. Its rivers ran more slowly. Its stone felt brittle underfoot. The old songs stuck in throats. Ash fell sometimes when there had been no fire. The fish came in seasons that no one could predict. There was a feeling in the air like a sound just beyond hearing. The king did not laugh. He walked the palace like a shadow of himself. Even his greatness had limits. They were pressing in. A man named Ar-Pharazôn, who had been proud to call his king by his name, with the sense that the name was a bright coin he could flip and catch, stopped using it. He said, "My lord," and felt safer. The people watched their leader grow thin and then large with swelling, and then thin again, the cycle of certain maladies that none could name in a land that did not expect disease. The king had chosen his ending. It had come and had not come, and now he lived in a marrow-deep confusion that transformed itself into anger at odd hours. He broke a cup and stared at the water on the floor, and did not know why he wanted to kneel and lap like a dog. He built a low hall at the far edge of the western cliffs. He went there alone. He sat on a bench and looked toward a light that was dimmer now, because Varda had pulled stars down so that Sauron could not measure by them. He spoke to someone. Whether he knew who he spoke to did not matter. "Take me," he said once, a whisper lost in the wind, "or leave me and be done. Do not leave me like this." The wind went on. He was a king, and the wind did not answer kings the way priests did. What did it mean that Númenor had won, if Wyn meant to plant banners in Valinor, and to sit under the shadow of Mount Tanicatil, and to drill troops on the white lawns of Tirion? It meant that the world looked at men and saw that they could do it. It meant that the Eldar would always tell a story at night when the wool was being carded and some child was not yet asleep, when they came and we could not stop them. It meant that the Valar walked more softly and weighed their hands before they lifted them. It meant that power idle is still power, and power that refuses to move can become a void that draws other things into it. The second attempt on the Door of Night came not in Valinor, but in a black place in Mordor, where Sauron had built a circle under a mountain with a roof that was not a roof, but the earth itself. He had men bow and elves stand, and orcs grunt, and wolves shudder, and trees that had no business there twist roots into the shape of petitions. He sang in a voice that remembered the music and had turned from it with joy. He cut the air in straight lines and in curves, and the air bled. Ar-Pharazôn felt it from his bench on the cliff. He stood. He walked to the very edge and looked into a night that had drawn back from stars. He closed his eyes and saw the first time he had held a sword, which had been heavier than he had expected. He saw his mother's hands. He saw Tamiriel's mouth at the moment of her last words, which he had not been able to fully hear through the roar in his own ears. He stepped forward a half step and then back. He was a man. He would always be a man. He could be a king, or he could be nothing. And being a man was a third thing he did not know how to be. Mandos felt the pull. He stood in his hall, and Vaira pressed her forehead to his shoulder for a moment, and his hand moved just once to touch her hair, which was made of threads, not hair, but was hair for him. Manwë looked toward the dark beyond the dark and weighed his choice again. Varda closed her eyes when she opened them. 3 birds that had been flying over a lake in Harad became fish in that lake and swam away. She had not meant to do that. The world had become available to accidents by a degree that startled her. Nienna went to the door and set her back against it and cried. Her tears were not water. They were forms of light bruised to blue. The circle opened. The song Sauron sang rose like smoke from damp wood. It did not burn clean. It stained. He did not care. He had caring for a different fire now. He would bring back his master. He would bring back the cool certainty of a will greater than his own. He would be free from the fear that he had left behind him in Valmar, in the form of a small seed gone dark. Isildur stood on the heights of Orodruin with a handful of men, because Elendil had said, "If he does this, he will change the air, and breathing will be different for our sons." They were not sure what they were supposed to do. They carried wood and flint. They carried rope. They carried a memory of a righteous theft. They watched the sky. Gulls flew inland from the coast of Belfalas because they did not like the feel of the sea. In the White Downs, a quiet people not yet called by the name all would remember later, put their heads under blankets and muttered all the little homely prayers they had ever known. There is power in small words, spoken close to the ground. Sauron pulled. The door creaked. Something vast put a hand to it from the other side. Nienna pushed, and Mandos lifted, and Varda threw a web that shone like frost, and Manwë spoke a word he had meant to save for the end of time, and still it opened a hair's breadth. A breath came through it. It was cold. It tasted like snow under black pines at midnight. It tasted like the moment before a lie. It tasted like power. Ar-Pharazôn fell to his knees on the cliff and gripped stone with fingers that tore. He spoke a name. He spoke a prayer. He spoke nothing. The wind had stopped. He heard only his own breath and the distant sound of waves striking rock like hands clapping without joy. Elendil looked up from the banks of Anduin and saw, in a sky he could not swear was the same as the one he had slept under since birth, a seam tear. It did not break. It tore and then sutured itself with a speed that made him think of a wound closing because the body refuses to die. He shouted orders. He did not know what they meant until later. On the mountain, Isildur's men lit torches. They did this because it was something they could do. They waved them and sang. Their voices were rough and not particularly pleasant, and their song was not an old one. It was something a boy had made up in Osgiliath a week ago. They sang with a defiance that had more to do with their own fear than any belief that they could be heard. Sauron, far below, smiled. He loved brave men with a tenderness he reserved for those he meant to bend. Nienna broke. Her back bent. The door slid an inch. A sound came through like the scrape of iron on iron as a great gate is dragged. Mandos spoke his word again, the one that had shut it the first time. It did not shut. He spoke it again, and again. Vaire threw threads. They burned. Ulmo came up through the veins of the earth, not just the sea, and his hand, which had been water and now was something else entirely, caught the edge and made it slick and pulled. The door moved a hair. Sauron snarled. He poured himself. He stopped smiling entirely. The world, its peasants, its kings, its eagles, its fish, its stones, shivered. Ar-Pharazôn stood. He walked. He went to a place above the cliff where the grass had always made him think of bed. He knelt again and pressed his forehead to it. he whispered 3 words. He whispered, "I was wrong." He did not know to whom he whispered this. He did not need to know. The words entered the ground like water. The door closed. It did not slam. It simply set itself back into its place. The sound of it, which had been a scream without shape, ceased. Sauron staggered. He had poured himself out. He would reform, but the act had cost him in ways he had not counted. He bared his teeth and laughed for the first time at his own mistake. Then he turned his face like a blade toward those men on a mountaintop, and those women on a riverbank, and that king on a cliff, and told himself there were other ways to win. Mandos remained at the door with one hand on it, like a man who has closed a gate and knows a child will run at it again. Nienna sat and wept. Varda made 3 new stars and hid them behind clouds so that no one would see them for years. Manwë sat and looked at his hands. He was not a man, but he looked at his hands like one. In Valinor, Ar-Pharazôn called Sauron before him and said nothing. That was wise, perhaps. Sauron bowed and smiled with his mouth. Then he stepped into shadow and out of that court and was gone. Ar-Pharazôn did not call for guards. He did not call for anything. He went back to his bench and sat. The immediate aftermath was a relief that tasted wrong. Men breathed and did not smell iron. Children laughed, and there was no scream under it. Elves sang to make their hands move, and their songs did not break. The sea, which had risen and pulled back like an animal startled by movement, settled. Fishermen drew nets and cursed and laughed. In the White Downs, a small boy went back to sleep and dreamed of potatoes. Then disquiet slipped in. Nights became longer by minutes that no one could prove were there. Farmers could not count their weeks right because the sun did not behave quite as it always had. The taste of bread was slightly altered, as if the yeast had learned a new habit. The stars, which had been friends, were now perhaps acquaintances who were polite in public but did not come by as often. Shapes moved on the edges of fields, which turned out to be foxes more often than not, which did not stop men from gripping their hoes like swords. Valinor was transformed, not broken, but changed. The white of Tirion looked grey in some weathers it had never known. Gardens grew with a vigour that suggested both joy and fear. The Valar walked their halls without the certainty of those who had never been questioned. In one room, Virys Looms stood still for a long time, and she sat with her hands on her knees and looked into middle distance, which for her was full of threads, and yet she looked and saw nothing. Yavanna went among her trees and sang to them, and they swayed, and she swayed with them, and if a leaf brushed her face, she did not pull away. The Eldar chose. Many went east. They carried their names and their devices and their grief like luggage. They came to Lindon and found welcome. They went on to Imladris, where a valley held them as if in a cupped palm. They stood on lonely ridges and looked toward a west they would never see again, and decided, one by one, to be a people in the east. That choice bent the world in a gentle way that felt like a hair being tucked behind an ear. Ar-Pharazôn aged. He did not die, or he did, and the story refuses to tell it simply. He became a man whose motions were slow and whose eyes were sharp. He stopped ordering sacrifices. He had the altars covered with tarpaulins that stank and flapped, and then he had them taken down. He walked through his city. Men watched him and tried to read what they would be allowed to want. He sat in the houses of those who had died at his command and ate their bread. Some refused to serve him. Some did with tears that fell into bowls and salted soups. He accepted the humiliation because he had no choice. He endured and called it rule. Sauron ruled as well, but he did not do it with banners and benches. He traded in fear and in the little habits that make men cowardly. He taught certain smiths to do certain work. 9 men came to him and left with gifts looped around their fingers, and they smiled with the smiles of those who think they have been called to kingship by a secret. They would reign in places where winter bit hard, and in deserts where sand hissed, and in forests where the wind played tricks. He made a kind of music with their names. He hummed it when alone. In Gondor, which had begun as tents, and had become stone under hands that bled, and then healed, and then bled again, Isildur extended walls. Osgiliath's bridges arched like ribs across the river. Minas Ithil gleamed as if it had swallowed moonlight and allowed it to glow under skin. Minas Anor warmed old bones at dusk. The people of Pelagir hauled rope and sang songs they pretended were old, because that made them feel safer. Isildur and Elendil spoke on a wall one evening, while a wind moved the river in waves that did not belong to it. This was the kind of conversation that reveals a man to himself as much as to the other. "Father," Isildur said, "we are doing a wild thing. We are building as if there is a future. If he comes down on us with the mountain, this will all be nothing." "It will not be nothing," Elendil said. "It will be stone and breath and effort. It will be love. If he crushes it, then he crushes that. If he does not, then it stands." "What if hope is a fool's habit?" Isildur asked. He smiled without strength. "What if we are building a house for a river to live in? Then we will learn to fish," Elendil said. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. He had done this when Isildur was a boy and had thought himself big already. He did it now, though his son could break him if he wished. What does it mean to be men, if not to build where some wind will always come and blow? That night in Mordor, Sauron listened to the wind like a man listening for a lover. He heard nothing. He thought of a seed that had rolled to a woman's hands and been pressed to stone. He thought of death, which he hated, and pride, which he had fed like a dog and which had bitten him like a dog. He decided to make the world so loud that no one could hear their conscience, even if it shouted. He sent armies. They went into Ithilien like storms that tear leaves. He sent whispers into halls where decisions were made. Men who had promised themselves they would never bent, as men will. He sent kindness into the houses of those who were tired and could not admit it. Kindness in the form of rest that would never end if they would only lie down. He sent wolves into valleys. He sent gold, which can be worse than wolves. He sat back and smiled and waited. The armies of Númenor, who had won, held Valmar and Tirion and built storage barns that had the clean lines of their aesthetic, and they stood on the steps of a palace and watched a sunset that did not feel like a victory. They married and had children who learned elvish names for doors and chairs. They grew old. That frightened them more than any spear. In Armanelos, a small girl crouched under a table and listened to her grandfather talk about the day the fleet went out, and knew that would be her story forever, and she did not know if that was something to want. A boy in the marshes of Rohan stood up from the reeds and saw men go by on horses in armor. He thought, someday that will be me. He had no idea that someday he would stand in a hall built of logs and smell roast meat and hear his own name shouted and know it was a weight he could lift. He lay down again. He watched the light dim. He remembered a night when the stars had shaken. He wondered if they would shake again. In the Shire that was not yet a Shire, a woman pulled a root from the dirt, shook it, and considered how to cook it. She had a child tugging at her sleeve and another in her belly. She sang under her breath. She did not know she sang an old tune that had come across the sea in the bones of a man named Hildor. It came to her like a heritage she had not requested. It sounded like comfort. The kin's strife came early to Númenor in this world, not only in Gondor later, simmering like a covered pot. Men had seen a king kneel at a cliff and whisper, and had not known what he said, and they made the words up as they wished, and then they killed one another to defend the versions they had invented. Priests burned books that had never been written. Simple men broke the arms of their neighbors. The sea lay and watched and did not care. But sometimes a wave would rise and slam without warning against a certain wall and knock loose a stone that would fall on a crate that would break and show a paper that would be read by someone who could still read without shaking. Elendil died later than this, and he died as he had lived, holding something that would break and choosing to hold it anyway. Isildur took what he should not have taken in one story in this story. He took a different thing. He took the burden of continuing. He cut fields. He held a sleeping child and looked down and felt fear and love in equal measure until he could not tell them apart. He made mistakes. He apologized. He fought. Sauron made Nazgul. He sent them out. They found kings whose fear of death outstripped their love of life. They whispered to them and took them by the hand like gentlemen leading ladies into a dance. The dance had no end. The men had thought they wanted that, and they were right in that the dance never ended. They were wrong in every other way. The Valar did not leave the world entirely. They stepped back. They decided to teach by absence. That is a hard lesson to hear and harder to teach. Manwë built inside himself a place that would not answer petitioners because the one had not answered him, and he decided that humility would be a better defense than thunder. Ulmo visited fishermen in dreams. Yavanna instructed women in gardens to let certain weeds grow because they would taste good in their soup. Varda lit stars and then hid them, letting only a few burn bright in certain seasons. When women were heavy with child and men were scything and needed something at the top of the sky to cut toward. What is the worth of a victory measured not in miles held, but in the texture of grief? What does it mean to win if the winning breaks the measure by which you might praise it? Men told the story of the day they walked in Valmar and thought themselves gods. They told it with pride. Then they told it with shame. Then they stopped telling it at all, and it slept in them like a bone. The world was transformed by their memory of the thing they had done, and by the restraint of those who could have unmade the world. Children grew up chasing each other under gates in Osgiliath, where the river sang between the stones. In the plains of Calenarton, horsemen learned to ride in a way that made even the wind respect them. In the downs where small folk would one day plant beans, beans sprouted. Númenor became a dream you could sail to if you were very lucky and if the sea was in a mood to lie. Some came and did not return. Some returned and would not say what they had seen. Ar-Pharazôn lay down one night and did not get up, and no one knew when to call it the end. They buried him in a tomb with a carved boat on the lid, as if he might leave by that door instead of the other. Tyrion's white stairs still filled with dust in certain weather. Children ran on them anyway, shouting. Elves went down to the sea at dusk and sang to themselves and to the sea and to a sympathy that had shrunk but not vanished, and sometimes the water lapped with a rhythm that was not its own. They spoke to Manwë less. They forgave Yavanna. They avoided Sauron's name as if it were a taste stuck in their mouths. The rhetorical questions that had haunted the story found their answers not in the final fight, but in the persistence that followed. What did victory give? It gave men the knowledge that they could take what had been denied them, and that having taken it, they would not know what to do with it. What did restraint save? It saved the possibility that men could learn. What did the faithful preserve? They preserved seed, and the faith that seeds find earth eventually. Faces went by. A girl in Armenelos grew old and sat in a doorway and talked to the children of other girls who had run with her, and she told them about ash on white stairs. A boy in Pelargir died unexpectedly from a fall off a new scaffold, and his wife threw a clay pot against a wall and loved him twice as much in her memory. A man in Rohan rode under sky and felt alive as if he had stolen life from someone and did not know whom. In the White Downs, a hobbit opened a window and smelled rain and thought of nothing grand and sighed happily in the same breath. What of Sauron? He stood on a balcony in Barad-dûr and looked out at a world whose strings he had begun to pluck in a new rhythm. He smiled. He had lost a door. He had learned a song. He would sing that song until someone made it stop. He wondered if anyone could. He believed they could not. He was wrong then, and right later, and wrong again. The world had never promised to be simple. Thematic reflections settled like mist. Men had reached beyond their mandate and taken, and they had not been destroyed by a hand from beyond the world, but by the limits of their own wanting. Restraint had held where power would have broken. Mercy had been present where justice stood like a pillar and did not move. The result was not peace. It was a world where the smallest acts mattered because the largest had been chosen wrongly or left undone. It was a world where building a wall and planting a tree and singing a song at a cradle could resist an evil that had not been crushed but had been turned aside once. There is a story told in time of a man who went up a white stair one afternoon when the light was strange and put his hand on the stone and felt it warm and knew someone had stood there in laughter 1,000 years before. He laughed and did not know why. The laugh sounded like relief and like fear. He climbed. He stood at the top. He looked west and saw nothing but cloud. He put his hand out as if to touch a door that was not there and drew it back. He went down and ate dinner. Life continued. In the end, the image that remained was simple and could be held by anyone. It was a bench on a cliff on a western shore where the grass was short and smelled of salt. On the bench, an old man sat, not carved in stone, not crowned. He looked at the horizon where there was no path and said nothing. Between his fingers, the wind found just enough room to play a note, and in the black glass of his eyes, the world was reflected upside down.